Okay, thanks so much to the organizers for inviting me to be part of this great conference. So let me start by thinking about this metaphor that I think Anton suggested, which I think is very helpful, which is what are the implications of being in contact with this country of geniuses? And the way that I want you to think about this country of geniuses is essentially, this is a country in the middle of the Pacific. You send compute to this country, and in exchange, it returns every types of economically valuable work. So it's just a technology that transforms computing power into work. And so that's kind of like how I want to think about AGI in general. And this paper is about working out the implications of that for wages, economic growth, the labor share, and so on. Okay, so let me tell you how I'm going to model this. So let's imagine, so this is going to be my macro slide of the day. Let's imagine that we're producing outputs on final good YT. So think about this as kind of like as a measure of the flourishing of the human species in the future. That's what YT is. And that's going to be a function of XT, which is a vector of all of the types of work that an economy has to accomplish in order to get the human species to flourish. So think of many things could be in this vector, like gathering energy, shelter, healthcare. All of these things are the types of things that we need to accomplish for the future of the species. And I'm going to denote all of these things by omega. They belong to some big set omega that denotes all the types of valuable work in this economy. Now, every type of work omega, you can also think of this as tasks, but for whatever reason I'm calling it work. But every type of work omega can be produced by humans, so that's the LT omega, or by AI systems. And so the way that I want you to think about these AI systems is, again, they eat compute and they regurgitate work on the other side. And so they're going to eat QT omega units of compute, and they're going to deliver 1 over alpha T omega units per unit of compute of that useful work. Now, this alpha T omega is going to be very important. That is essentially a measure of how many computing power do I need in order to match what 1 unit of human labor delivers. So this is a measure of algorithmic progress. Now, how are people producing stuff? Well, people have different skills S. There's a total endowment HS of people of skill S. And people of a given skill, what they can do is that they can accomplish different types of work that belong to a set omega S. And so in particular, the resource constraint of this economy for labor takes a very simple form. It says that the total amount of human labor that is allocated to all of these types of works that people of skill S can do has to be less than or equal than the total supply of people with said skill. Finally, we need to think about computational resources. So we're going to have this big Q, which is the total amount of computing power per unit of time that we can do in this economy. So think of this as the number of computations, flops per unit of time or flops per year that we can implement in this economy given the hardware that we currently have. So this is going to be the second type of technological progress that I'm going to have in this model. So this is total computational resources per year, and I'm going to assume that this keeps growing over time. So I'm thinking of 2 forms of technological progress: algorithmic progress, those are the alphas, and computing progress, that is the Q. Okay? So now let's go back to this figure and let's try to think about what the premise of the workshop means in terms of this model that I introduced. We have the AGI country, the country of geniuses. They're eating compute, they're spitting out work. Now, Anton said that one definition of AGI is that they're able to produce all cognitive work. But in reality, I think that we need to extend that, because if you give them actuators and ways to act on the physical work, they can also produce physical work. And the only way that you need to do in order to model this is think of QT not only as compute, but QT is going to be like a combination of computing, energy, and the materials needed in order to build the robots that you're going to use for acting on the real world. And I'm going to argue, I mean, this is part of the premise, but I'm going to provide some arguments at the end that you could think that social work, so work that requires interaction with people, is also something that these AGIs can achieve with sufficient compute. So the example that I give in the paper is just think of a therapist. Like initially people were like, oh, therapy, that's something that is very human, is something that we really want to have a person on the other side. Flash forward, like people are happy to anthropomorphize these computer systems. And imagine these computer systems, they know you better than anyone else. They don't get tired. They are there and they have like this huge amount of compute devoted to just figuring out what's wrong with you. Like, are you going to insist on seeing a person, or are you going to see this fantastic system? I'll take the system. So I think that in general, we can even think that even social work could in principle be completed by these systems if we have enough compute and enough algorithmic progress. So the way that I'm going to think about the definition of AGI is I want to think about this as a limit when I have enough computing resources and where all of the alphas converge to some finite values. They can be very large, so maybe I need a lot of computational resources to implement something, but they're going to be finite. So that's going to be my definition of what AGI means. Okay. Now we can disagree with that definition, and I'm happy to discuss that during the Q&A. But let me kind of postulate that this is what's going to happen. I don't know if this is what's going to happen. I think that I don't have a good argument for why it wouldn't happen. So I'm just going to take it as given, and I'm just going to figure out what are the implications of this. So another way of thinking about this definition is that essentially AGI is a technology for turning compute in every type of useful work. So compute becomes kind of like a universal input, so to speak. So let me kind of walk you through the results. For my results, it's going to be very important to have a definition of bottlenecks. So a lot of people have said the word bottlenecks today, and I think that everyone has a different definition of bottlenecks in mind. So I have my own definition of bottlenecks. So let me give you my definition of bottleneck. I'm going to say that one specific type of work, omega, is a bottleneck if you have a sequence such that output diverges for that sequence. Either that quantity has to be growing, so we need more of it to get output to grow, or the value, the marginal value of that type of work explodes and becomes unbounded. Okay? So if I have a sequence where we're getting infinite output, either that quantity of work is expanding or it's becoming increasingly valuable. That's going to be my definition of bottleneck. And then all the things that are not a bottleneck, I'm going to call them accessory work. So the key property for accessory work is that you can get infinite output while holding this type of work constant without getting its value to explode. Okay? So that distinguishes, you get kind of like a partition of all of work into bottleneck work and accessory work. So now we're in a position, oh, sorry, I forgot to give some examples. So, it's hard to give examples because this really depends on how technology looks in the future and so on, but I think that there are some things that we can agree. So for example, I think that healthcare is a bottleneck work. This is a thing that either in the future we're going to have better health or we're going to be willing to pay a lot for getting better health. So that's kind of like my definition of a bottleneck. Preserving the safety of our species in the universe, that's probably like bottleneck work. Shutting down asteroids that are coming towards the Earth, that's going to be like bottleneck work. Extending our lifetime, that can be bottleneck work. Finding new sources of energy, that can be bottleneck work, right? And accessory work, I don't know, like many of the things that we do are perhaps accessory work because you don't really need them for the flourishing of the species in the long run. So for example, like, I don't know, like having people, this is not a good example because transporting people might be a bottleneck work, but for example, having a waitress or something like that could be accessory work, like the willingness to pay for having someone bring you the food to the table, maybe that's not gonna explode in this future if we don't automate that, okay? So the first result is that if you move to this AGI world, all bottleneck work is gonna be eventually automated, but there might be accessory work that is not automated and is left untouched by AI. So this is important because remember, in principle, we could do everything with AI, but this is showing that we're not necessarily gonna do everything with AI. For sure, we're gonna do the bottlenecks with AI. So let me give you kind of like the simple argument behind this result. So imagine, so the first point is that because I can produce everything with compute and compute is expanding, it must be the case that output is growing without bound in this economy. So the second point is imagine that omega, one type of work, is a bottleneck. So either its quantity is expanded, which means that we automated it because we had finite skills to do it, or its price is growing without bound, which means that at some point it's going to be economically profitable to take some of the compute that we have and automate it because the value of that is going to be huge. The only case in which you're going to leave something untouched if it's accessory, which means that even though we have people doing it, its value, it's not exploding. So the wages that you have to pay people for that work are not exploding, and so you don't have growing incentives to automate it. And so again, the reason why you're leaving this job untouched is just because those computing resources, they have an opportunity cost. You can use them for all of these fantastic bottlenecks. So one of the things that I think is interesting is that imagine a future, for example, where the only type of thing that is a bottleneck work is science and reducing existential risks and healthcare. So we could be in a future where we are using these AI systems and all of our compute for this type of work, and the rest of the economy remains essentially completely unchanged. And that could happen, right? So this accessory work can provide kind of like a stable source of employment for all of us. So if you think that you're doing accessory work, kind of like good for you. Your labor market is not going to change a lot into the future. If you're doing bottleneck work, it might change a little bit, and I'm going to explain exactly how. So now, this seems to run counter to the principle of comparative advantage. Because let's imagine for a second that all work in this economy is a bottleneck. So essentially what my first result tells you is that everything in the economy gets automated. But wait, didn't Ricardo told us many years ago that we should specialize? Like we have this country of geniuses, so the geniuses should be performing something and we should specialize in something else, and there's gains from specializations? Well, not really. So let's kind of like think about what Ricardo actually says, or let's think why Ricardo's argument doesn't work in this case. Let's imagine that I specialize. So let's imagine that there are two things. So there's bread and there's wine. And AI is great at producing bread, I guess. And humans are great at producing wine. So if we specialize, what this effectively means is that we're going to have a growing quantity of bread, and we're going to have finite wine to enjoy that bread. That cannot be optimal. So it's going to be much better to have infinite quantities of both things. So therefore, a specialization is not always optimal. This is actually kind of like a footnote to Ricardo. Like what he said is that if the two countries are similar in size, you get specialization. But if you have a very big country and a very small country, the small country specializes, the big country doesn't specialize. So if the US starts trading with Malta, there's no reason to specialize because you're trading with Malta, right? Like you're supposed to keep producing everything yourself. And here something similar is happening. The AI is not specializing because we're there. So they produce essentially everything. So we're happy. What good is a world with abundance of bread and no wine? Second result. So let's imagine everything is a bottleneck. And I want to provide a characterization of what happens with wages. Because this wasn't obvious to me, like because AI is going to produce everything, that doesn't mean that wages are zero. The reason is because AI essentially can replicate what you're doing, but it can do it at a cost, the opportunity cost of the compute needed to do whatever is the thing that you're supplying in the market. So let me define these CEUS as the compute equivalent units of skill S. This is how many units of computing power I need to replicate you at your best or your most complex possible work. Now, what I show in the paper is that if all work is a bottleneck, then output essentially becomes additive between compute and human skills, but the human skills are going to be valued at their compute equivalent units. And that A on the front is a positive number that gives me the rate of transformation of compute into output. So this is how much extra output do I get per unit of compute. And so from this expression, you can see immediately that wages are going to be equal to AT times your compute equivalent units. So you're going to be paid the opportunity cost of the computing resources that you're saving by working. So this is interesting. I didn't know this. Like in this model, just because you produce everything with AI doesn't mean that there are no wages. AI is just lowering the cost of work, and you're being paid that price of the work. Now, the sad news is that you can also see from here that, well, I'm not going to do the proof. I'm going to skip it. But the sad news is that you can also see from here that the economy is growing because Q is growing, but wages remain fixed. Okay, so essentially the labor share is going to go to zero in this economy, which means that all of the income is going to be income accruing to whoever owns this compute. What about the accessory work that I told you doesn't necessarily get automated? Can that be a source of growing wages? Well, it cannot. So let me make the argument. So let's go back to the general case where you have bottleneck work and accessory work. And let's imagine that your work doesn't get automated. What does that mean? That means that your wage is low, right? So that means that actually your wages are lower than the opportunity cost of the computing needed to automate your job. So the fact that you don't get automated in this accessory work is not necessarily good news from the point of view of wages. That just means that we have already too many of you. So it's not worth automating you. So this zone outside of the automated work provides a stable employment opportunities, but it's not going to provide growing wages. So you're still going to get that the labor share goes to zero, even though not everything gets necessarily automated. Next result, the labor share is going to zero. So many people worry at this point and say, well, definitely has to be the case that workers are worse off and that they really depend on getting some of the income from compute. Well, that's not the case. There's actually gains from trade here. So what one can show is that at every point in time in this post-AGI economy, wages, this is the sum of wages of all humankind, are going to exceed the initial wages that they had in the pre-AGI economy. So workers, as a whole, they have to benefit. So this one I do want to make the proof because I think it's cool and it doesn't have any math. So this is the proof. So we know that the long-run allocation has to maximize output. So let's imagine that I'm a planner and I take a representative group of workers and I send them to a no AI zone, a zone that is not using AI at all. Because of constant returns to scale, they can produce the exact same output that they produced initially, namely their wages. What am I giving up when I do that? I'm giving up their current wages in the post-AGI world. Because the initial allocation maximized output that has to reduce output, so initial wages have to be bigger than, final wages have to be bigger than initial wages. And so there's Ricardo in a no AI zone. So as long as you have no AI zones that are not competing for resources with the AI economy, you can guarantee that wages are not going to go down. Final results. So I have two results about the transitions because the results that I showed you previously are about the long-run implications, the limit, what happens along the transition. So for the transition, there's also this result that I thought was very, very interesting to me, which I didn't anticipate. There are essentially two classes of transitions. There's one transition where compute binds, and there's one transition where algorithms bind. So let me explain first this transition where compute binds. So the idea is that at every point in time, we don't have enough compute to justify automation. So even though the algorithmic capabilities are there, it takes a while for us to get enough compute to finally start doing it. That transition actually doesn't look very scary at all. Your wages are growing, and you just get automated the moment that your wages reach the opportunity cost of producing what you're doing with compute. At that point, actually, the technology doesn't even displaces you in the sense that there's not a jump in employment, but employment starts decreasing gradually in the job that you start doing with AI. So you start deploying AI gradually in that particular type of work. And only when you have finished leaving that type of job, wages start growing again, and then the next type of work that you're doing starts getting automated and so on. So you get this pattern where there are no jumps. Everything is very predictable, and essentially your wages in the long run are going to be higher than your wages initially. Now, this is very different. So for me, this is again interesting because there might be applications of AI, like AI for science, that are eating all of the computing power. And so that means that you're not going to have a lot of displacement going on in the back. It's just kind of like this displacement is just going to come slowly in the future, only when we have enough computing power to justify automation. So maybe the transition is not a bumpy ride, which was my prior. The transition is only a bumpy ride when technology binds. So this is an economy where you have a huge amount of compute. The AI companies are playing with their algorithms. Suddenly they figure out a way to automate economic professors, and boom, immediately we have enough compute to do it, and wages might actually decrease when that happens. So in those transitions, you get this pattern that looks very risky, which is when there's algorithmic progress, wages go down. When there's algorithmic progress, wages go down, then they go back increasing, and then at the end they go back again and converge to the opportunity cost of the computational resources needed to replace you. So let me take stock just by saying that this paper introduces a way of thinking about AGI. This is a definition, like people might disagree with this definition, and I think Neil is going to offer perhaps a different perspective. This is a technology for turning compute into all forms of useful work, including cognitive, physical, and social work. All bottleneck work is going to be automated, and only this accessory work is going to be left untouched. Labor still has value. There's still positive wages. Your wages are pinned down by the opportunity cost of the compute needed to replace you. The value of labor shrinks, That's the only issue. So the labor share goes to 0. But this is a rich economy, and we collectively own the compute. So we are richer as a result. Not only that, but our collective wages are higher than before. So there's no sense in which work or labor as a whole is getting decimated in this economy. There's also the bottom line that accessory work might provide stable opportunities for people. So there's one future in which our lives do not change at all because we end up using all of the computing power to conquer the galaxy and to run fusion reactors, and it's not worth it using on what we are doing. And finally, the transition may be smooth. And this will happen if we think that there are killer applications for this computing power that are eating away most of our computational resources. Thank you. I'll discuss this later.
Okay. So I think Pascual did a very good job with this, so I'm just going to give a quick summary, right? What he finds is that he proposes this model of economic growth that has this very nice and very tractable form, right? We say the output, the X that you're going to put in is either coming from the labor or is coming from Q, the amount of compute that you're putting in here, that you're getting from it, and of course, oh, no, that's not right. Oh, we don't have the pointer on there? Okay. But you have this alpha here, which is saying, what's the conversion rate, right? It takes some amount of compute in order to convert it into 1 unit of labor. Great. Now, the first thing I want to say that I really like about this work is it's really acknowledging the importance of bottlenecks, and we heard a lot about that from Ben earlier, right? And it does this beautiful partition that says some of these things are really crucial for the economy, some of them are not. If it's not crucial for the economy, it doesn't need to be part of this ride that we're going to be going on. And I think that's just a first order important thing to think about, because if there's a whole bunch of accessory work, as he said, this can change the labor outcomes in a meaningful way. With the result, the economy continuously uncouples from human labor until it scales linearly with compute, right? This is because all of those tasks become bottlenecked, and then they're become used by AI. During this transition, humans can still be employed, but only in areas that are more efficient or in accessory areas. Okay, labor share of output does fall to 0, and the automation of science accelerates growth. Great. Okay, so I think importantly here, right, this Q, he mentioned this, Q is not just actually just compute, right? It can be, if you have to have robots, it can be energy, it can be the materials that go into robots, things like that. And so there's some implicit scaling there that's going to tie us to the rest of the material economy, and I'll talk about that in a second. Okay, so there's a lot to like about this paper. So it's a really elegant model. It is not sort of assuming Cobb-Douglas or anything like that. It's a very general form that it allows it. And it's a real embrace of the TAI agenda, right? This is saying all work can be done, and it sort of puts us in that world in a really useful way. I also am, while I did, in my response, I do quibble a little bit with the exact AGI definition that Pascual uses. I actually think that broadly that's actually a really big step forward, because what it's saying is, here's an economic definition of TAI, not just a technical one, right? And most of the discussion that's been happening about these sort of transformative things comes at it from a technical point of view. I think actually having an economic definition is great. I have little quibbles. I'm not going to spend any time on that, actually. And then I do like, you mentioned this specifically in your talk, I really like that you say, in so much as like humanness is a means to utility, actually it's pretty compelling to argue that we will be able to replace that. We'll be able to find a way to have other things that compensate for that. And we see that all over the place, right? We don't use bank tellers. It's nice that the ATM is open all the time. Okay, so in terms of model limitations, there's sort of two things I want to pick up here. And so the first one is really the constant returns to scale. This is doing a lot of work in Pascual's model that we get to do this. And because we have this very broad aggregator function, this constant returns to scale is not just constant returns to scale in production, it's constant returns to scale in production, and then how production turns into utility. Okay, and that means that there are a whole bunch of things that we've talked about over the last couple of days that don't really get subsumed in this, right? So if we have limits from other resources, satiation points, decreasing marginal benefit of different products, positional goods, all of these things are going to sort of derail the constant returns to scale if we think any of those things are bottlenecks. There are also, we argue in our response, there are cases where humanness might not be the means to utility, but actually the ends, right? So in the Olympics, the whole point is that it's humans doing it, right? And you can say, like, I don't care how much faster the machine can run, like, it is the humanness that matters here. Okay, so I think that's sort of a very important one. I'm not going to say much more about that. I want to focus for the rest of my discussion on the second one, which is that in this model, compute is expanding exogenously. And I'm going to argue that actually implicitly under the hood, it's not just that it's increasing exogenously, but actually the cost effectiveness of compute has to be increasing as well. Okay, so let's think about that in a particular context. So, for this whole conference, we've been talking about transformative AI and this idea that we can sort of get all the way to, it can do all tasks that a human can do. What I want to ask is, what if we're quite close to that, but not all the way there right away? Right? And this could very much be from the bottlenecks argument, and we sort of heard that that matters a lot. So in that case, what matters here is the transition that we're going to go through to AGI. And Pascual does a really nice job in the paper, and you heard it here, of characterizing sort of two extremes of this. One version where it's the algorithmic progress that's the limit, and one where it's the computational progress that's the limit. And I want to argue that actually we're going to be living very much in something in between those things, and actually thinking about what that looks like is not an easy thing, but could very well get us into a world where bottlenecks matter a ton, even for the production of compute, which might matter a lot here. So let me talk about what I mean here. So crucially, along this transition that Pascual has, we have to expand all bottlenecks work at the same rate, right? That makes a lot of sense in terms of how we're going to do this. And because we have these computational resources going exogenously, eventually we're going to accumulate enough. But of course, the question is, how much do we actually have to do? If it's more than 100% of the economy, that's going to be a problem, obviously. Okay, so I want to take a second to sort of jump back to think about what some recent benchmarks tells us about this jagged frontier of AI capabilities. So this is something from the GPT-4 technical report. When it came out, right, I think it caused quite a big splash. And what it said was, for actually working on the bar exam, right? They went from the 10th percentile to the 90th percentile, from GPT 3.5 to GPT 4. That's only about a 10x increase in the amount of compute being used. It was a huge improvement in performance, right? If that's true, then we probably are going to be in a compute abundant world because we're going to be able to accumulate compute quite quickly. But on the other side, we have something that Sendil mentioned yesterday. So the ARC AGI 2 benchmark. Right, this is a case where we've gone from 0% to 30% on this benchmark with about 10,000x increase in compute. Okay, and just to be clear, for almost all of these benchmarks, that first little bit is a lot easier to get than the last bit. Right, so this is one where it's very plausible that there could be many, many orders of magnitude of compute necessary to get to human level of performance. Okay, so if we think about this more generally, I think we can think of this as coming from underlying things about how good these models are, not just on benchmarks, but on general performance. And so here I want to call back to scaling laws. I think this is one of the unusual audiences where probably most people in this audience are familiar with it, but if you aren't, the key thing here is that in almost every area that we look at it, we get this pattern, denoted in each of these cases by the dotted line, which says that as we increase the amount of compute, by which we mean the number of parameters in the model, the amount of data, we get this very predictable improvement in performance as we go on. Okay, and we can see that in all of these different domains that we have. Now, the crucial thing about the sort of form of this particular, of these scaling laws is that they say that if you want to have the amount of loss that you have left, right, you're getting 10% of the time you're making a mistake, you want to get down to 5%, 5% down to 2.5%, and so on, you have this very predictable relationship about how much you have to increase the amount of compute that's involved. Well, how much? Well, for improving on images, these are pretty small images. It's only 40x. Video, 140x. Bottom right-hand side language, 1.9 million x. That's a really big number, right? Okay, so why does this mean that compute might be constrained in the way that we might worry about the exogenousness in Pascual's model? Well, what if we just needed to say, well, we need to have the amount of error that LLMs are making in order to get to some level of performance? Right? That seems like a pretty reasonable thing you might imagine. Well, current models cost about $1 billion to train. The scale-up required 1.9 million x, right? We just saw that. So that's 20 times the world economy. All right, that's a big number. If we needed to decrease LLM error by 75% in this underlying measure, okay, now it's 40 million times the world economy. Okay, so this suggests that if there only have to be a small number of these tasks that are the bottleneck tasks that Ben was telling us about to lead to the situation where we could very well be compute constrained for a long, long time in actually doing these things. Okay, so this is sort of a particular form of how we've improved models, right? These scaling laws tell us we can increase compute. Of course, we also, if you're in these companies, you're doing a lot of other things. You're thinking about clever algorithmic things. You have people at Intel and NVIDIA thinking about clever hardware things. If we look at the actual progress that we've had over the last years, how does that actually look? Well, it looks like this. Okay, so this is looking at the effective compute increase. So this is both the compute increase we paid for and also the compute that we didn't have to do because we were clever about our algorithms or clever about our hardware. And what you can see here is that over the period from 2014 to 2023, right, we have gotten algorithmic efficiency. That's the cleverness of, we figure out distillation, or we prune our models, all those kind of things you hear about. 22,000x, that's pretty good, right? Hardware efficiency, all the stuff that NVIDIA is doing, about a 45x improvement. But hardware quantity is the dominant way we've gotten it, right? Almost 400,000x in terms of increase in this, right? So this does suggest that the dominant way that we have gotten performance improvement so far has been by scaling up the amount of compute, and that suggests that it could be a limit in the stuff that we're going to do in the future. Okay, so just to finish here, it's a beautiful model, and I really appreciate that it's pushing the step forward in this. Scaling laws, though, do imply that in the foreseeable future, we're likely to be in a transition state, not in sort of end state. And if we endogenize the production of compute into this model, that probably could even slow the transition down that we would get. And so I think focusing on those transitional dynamics that Pascual is already doing, I just want to see more in that middle ground of what happens when some tasks are and some tasks aren't, I think would be really important. Thank you.